So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of themes that we work on, particularly with WILPF. Firstly, to talk a bit about international advocacy on disarmament and weapons and why we do this. As an organisation, at Article 36, we want to see civilians and communities better protected from violence, and that's kind of our goal. And we think that one way we can work towards this is through developing and creating new international law and standards to prohibit and restrict weapons and tactics by militaries that cause sort of particular harm to civilians. Obviously, making new international law is only a first step, but it's something that we focus on. And in doing this, the approach we're working with is to try and set high standards that stigmatize certain technologies and behavior, putting pressure on weapons that we think are particularly unacceptable, to encourage kind of all states to conform with the norms that are being generated at the international level. And this is a dynamic we've seen work quite well in relation to, for example, anti-personnel mines, which were prohibited by a treaty in 1997. These were once widely seen as like very acceptable, widely used weapons by militaries. Not all countries joined this treaty at the start, but now very few countries or armed groups will be using anti-personnel landmines because they've become very stigmatized, very unacceptable. So our role as a small organisation in doing this kind of work, as Cecilia said, is on building partnerships with other civil society organisations, including WILPF as a global movement and their disarmament team based out of New York. And we also work with supportive governments at the international level to develop sort of policy analysis and ideas around new proposals for standards and strategies to get there politically. So I'm going to quickly tell you about two areas that we work on in this way with WILPF and what's sort of going on with them currently. So firstly, one of the main causes of civilian suffering in war today is the widespread bombing and shelling in villages and towns and cities that takes place in conflict. So wars are increasingly being fought where people live, but with weapons that are mostly designed for use in some idea of an open battlefield. So explosive weapons, which operate through projecting blast and fragmentation and include things like aircraft bombs, rockets and mortars. These kill thousands of people worldwide every year, destroy services and infrastructure, and when they're used in populated areas, over 90% of people killed and injured are civilians, data suggests. So certainly some of this is from the deliberate targeting of civilians and indiscriminate bombing, which is already illegal under international law. But much of it comes from the fact that if you use explosive weapons in populated areas against military targets, particularly weapons that have a wide area effect, because there are large aircraft bombs which cause an explosion over a wide area, or they're kinds of weapons which can't be easily directed at a particular target, then the chances of harming civilians or affecting civilian buildings is just very high. And because a lot of this use of bombs in towns and cities will often be legal, right? And these weapons and tactics are very important to militaries. The fact of this high level of civilian harm, it's kind of become normalized that this is just something that happens in war, but we think it's something that can and should be challenged. So we coordinate the International Network on Explosive Weapons, which WILPF is part of the steering committee of, and it's currently calling on states to adopt an international political declaration to commit to avoiding using explosive weapons which have a wide area effect, in particular in populated areas, because of the harm this causes to communities. And this, we see as very much kind of a really initial step in addressing this issue, because it's a big problem, and like I said, it's something that's very normalized, so we have to approach this through a number of avenues. But we've been working with governments, the International Committee for the Red Cross and UN agencies to build up a call for an international political commitment on this issue over the past few years. And currently the government of Ireland is leading a process to develop a political declaration on this subject. that states will sign on to and then commit to further work on this issue, to change their policies, to do better, to prevent and address this kind of harm. Currently, these negotiations on the text of a commitment are on hold because of the pandemic. It was meant to be concluded in May, but they're hoping to conclude the negotiations in Geneva early next year after some online consultations. Because we're WILPF UK as a seminar, currently the UK government, just to let you know, is sort of participating in this process with some scepticism as their general orientation to this and a lot of new weapons and disarmament issues, is that the application of existing law and international humanitarian law, the laws of war, will be enough to meet this challenge. We don't agree, obviously, for reasons I've talked about. But our work as a network at the moment is mainly to encourage governments to participate in this process and encourage the adoption of as strong a declaration text as is possible with our advocacy, with our analysis, and with the other NGOs that we work with. So at the moment, this is quite a sort of diplomatic level campaign and without much sort of public mobilization, but we think it will move on to that when we have this political commitment secured. The second area of work I'll just quickly talk about today is nuclear weapons. And I see on the call there's a lot of people who are part of ICANN, so know everything I'm going to say. So this is more for the benefit of people who don't know much about this work. But as Cecilia said, Article 36 is on the International Steering Committee of ICANN, along with WILPF. And our work within that campaign has been focused on building a strategy for and confidence in the idea of a treaty banning nuclear weapons without the participation of the nuclear armed states in the process initially. So the idea behind this is that for a long time in nuclear disarmament, we've been stuck because the nuclear armed states, 9 of them, have not wanted or sort of felt any kind of incentive or pressure to engage in nuclear disarmament. But these weapons of mass destruction still exist and threaten us every day, right? And although we as activists and other countries who aren't nuclear armed, we don't have the power to take away these nuclear weapons, right? But what we do have some power to do is to take away these weapons' legitimacy and to erode the idea that some countries having weapons of mass destruction is acceptable in international relations. So a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, which didn't exist before 2017, helps us with this by drawing a kind of clear international legal line about nuclear weapons. So since 2010, states, various governments and others, including ICANN, have been working to try and change the international policy discourse on nuclear weapons a bit, to introduce a focus on what the humanitarian and environmental consequences of these weapons actually are if a nuclear weapon detonates, right, which are huge and catastrophic. And through doing that, we wanted to shift the focus away from just talking about theories around, how do nuclear weapons contribute to state security and things like that, to focus on what they actually do as technologies. So this was known as the Humanitarian Initiative on Nuclear Weapons, and it involved a number of sort of international conferences to look at the evidence around what nuclear weapons do. And basically, the only kind of morally and legally sound conclusion from any analysis of the impact of nuclear weapons you can make is that they should be banned. So countries that were involved in this humanitarian initiative took the step in 2017 of negotiating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons to respond to this through a mandate from the UN General Assembly in New York. The treaty was adopted by over 120 states. A lot of us were there at the negotiations, which was very exciting. And ICANN's role there was to try and push to make the treaty as strong as possible. It will enter into force, which means it will become law for the states that join it. We believe sort of within the next year. Basically, it needs 50 states to ratify it, and we're currently at 38. The UK government's orientation to the humanitarian initiative and the treaty has been very hostile and negative, as has the attitude of a lot of other nuclear armed states, though they've been sort of varied. In particular, the UK has taken the line that the treaty on the one hand is ineffectual because it tries to shortcut complex processes, but on the other hand, it also might be dangerous because it could contradict or undermine other legal obligations, which we don't think is true. And our government has also put diplomatic pressure on other allies and countries not to engage with this treaty process, which other nuclear armed states have also been doing. And in that context, it's been quite encouraging to see the work that has been done in this area. The UK government has also repeatedly insisted that it will never sign this treaty or consider it customary law. And I guess we'll see what happens about that in the future. But either way, we can use this treaty that now exists to sort of highlight and put pressure on the illegitimacy of the continued possession of nuclear weapons by the UK and other countries. So locally and nationally, ICANN is running quite a few actions that people can be involved in. We have the ICANN Cities Appeal, which is aimed at getting commitments from city authorities and local government to support the treaty in order to raise awareness about the treaty and the consequences of nuclear weapons and how out of step the UK and other nuclear armed states now are with world and public opinion, and put pressure on the central government. There's also a parliamentary pledge for MPs, which has a similar idea behind it. And another sort of main thing that ICANN campaigners are working on is around the financing of nuclear weapons. So private companies are involved in the maintenance of several countries' nuclear weapons, and our money through our banks and pension funds is implicated in this. So ICANN and the Dutch peace organisation PAX produce a report on how this works every year called Don't Bank on the Bomb. And this encourages campaigners to sort of use this information and the treaty to take campaigning and personal action to encourage financial institutions to disinvest from nuclear weapons producers, and to highlight this issue and bring more attention onto stigmatizing nuclear weapons. So I think Tanielle will talk a little bit more about that. I'll leave it there now because I think that's my 10 minutes up, but look forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me again.
Okay, I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was amazing. I will move swiftly on to Verity, who I've introduced before, so there's no need for me to do that again. Hi, Verity.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, sorry, Verity, before I mute myself again, I just saw a quick question on the chat. Yes, we will be sharing the presentations as well, because they will be in the video, so no need to take notes.
Thank you, and thanks to WILPF UK for having us here to talk about these topics. I'm going to talk about the Arms Trade Treaty, and before I do, I think I just want to kind of note that women are very much underrepresented in arms control and disarmament generally. So UNIDIR has published stats that say that in 2018, only 27% of delegates to the Arms Trade Treaty talks were women, 73% were men, and actually 77% of heads of delegation roles were held by men. And I think that if we're looking for equal and meaningful participation to become a reality, we will start to see more inclusive, effective and sustainable policy outcomes as a result. So in the NGO sector, we do tend to have women very well represented, and I think that's been true across all the disarmament processes I've worked in. But actually the government representation that is leading these negotiations or talking about how to implement this policy is very, very lopsided at the moment. So, you can tell that I haven't done this very often yet. So I just want to go that way. No, sorry about that. Let's try that way. This is annoying. Okay. Why did we need the Arms Trade Treaty? It's a multi-billion-dollar trade in arms, and it's was held virtually to no internationally recognised standards. There were regional instruments or sets of regulation that were in place, but before the ATT, there was nothing globally. So we wanted to try and reduce the risk that the exported arms would be used to carry out the worst crimes imaginable, such as genocide. And the role that WILPF played in establishing the gender-based violence criteria of this treaty was huge. It's the first international instrument of its kind to reference and have obligations placed on states in relation to the harm that can be done through gender-based violence in relation to arms exports. So what is it? It's a pioneering treaty. It's a baby of a treaty. It's only a few years old. And for all the frustration I can feel when I speak to governments about how well or not they are implementing this treaty, I try and remember what colleagues at the ICRC keep telling me, is that to build good international norms takes time, it takes commitment, and it takes being in it for the long game, which again, the work that your organisation has done on many of these instruments is a testament to that. And so far we have 106 member states. The treaty entered into force really fast, and it will be celebrating its birthday on Christmas Eve, which when I worked at Control Arms was always slightly difficult, because when people wanted to talk about it, everybody was getting their Christmas dinner ready, but that's how it happened. That's when the 50th ratification came in a couple of weeks before, so then it entered into force. The goals of the treaty were, as you can see here, reduce human suffering. It has humanitarian and human rights goals at its core. It's kind of the heart of the treaty, but it is a regulation treaty, it's not a ban treaty, and governments can get very prickly if we talk about it in any other way. And these slides will be shared, but I'm going to move through them quite quickly. So what does it provide and what does it obligate states to do? These things here, but the thing that I want to kind of talk about is that heart of the treaty, that is, weapons shall not be transferred if they are going to seriously harm people, if they're going to fall into the hands of people who will use them to abuse human rights in a variety of ways. And this is Article 7, where the gender-based violence criteria fits. So it's 7.4 down at the bottom. I should have highlighted that one. But it asks governments, it tells governments to take into account the risk of the weapons being used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or violence against women and children. Now, there is, I know that this is being recorded and is public, so I'm just trying to choose my words carefully, because some governments show good understanding and good commitment to really operationalizing this part of the treaty. Others find it very difficult because their definition of gender, their understanding of it comes from a different place. The problem that I see with that is that this isn't a take it or leave it part of the treaty. This is a part of the treaty that must be enacted. So when we talk about serious violations of international human rights law or defining gender-based violence, UN Women say every time I hear them speak that governments saying we can't work on this properly because we don't have a completely agreed international definition. It's a smokescreen, it's a rabbit hole. We know what the harms done are when we talk about gender-based violence, and we can pin them onto existing international law and regulation. So here is a kind of cobble together of international law that exists to define gender-based violence. We're moving towards agreement on this within the Arms Trade Treaty process, but we are spending, in my opinion, far too much time continuing to talk about this. And a serious violation of international human rights, it's determined by the character, so the gravity of that violation, but also the extent of harm that victims suffer. And so legally, it's a very low threshold that does require a case-by-case holistic assessment. The other treaties and conventions that we can relate to when we're talking about this piece of work are listed here. And again, some of these have been around for a very long time. Governments have these obligations, they have these commitments, and this is what we would ask them to consider, both in terms of the end user that is requesting the transfer. Do they have the capacity to honour all of these commitments? Are they taking full and proper steps to make sure that when crimes are committed within their borders, that they are investigated, that they are punished, that they are taken through judicial system. Acts of GBV, though, can violate international human rights law, even if perpetrated by a non-state actor. And that is something that differentiates it from other parts of the treaty work that we do. And a state does have due diligence obligation to prevent, investigate, and punish when that does occur. Overriding risk is another term that does not have an agreed definition. At the moment, 106 countries are filling in a survey to say how they interpret these words and how they have written that into their domestic law. But the part that is interesting to us is that actually, if GBV is occurring, it's hard to imagine mitigation that a state could put in effectively to completely take that risk away, to bring it below the threshold of overriding risk. So therefore, if there are cases and incidents of GBV happening, which will be harder to detect, there will be less of them, the data might not be readily available, but they should be taken seriously by the exporter state. And we don't think that actually mitigation measures will be sufficient to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. This is one of the resources that I've shared with Cecilia, and I've also sent some other pieces. Harvard Law School did a paper for us last year, which was looking at gender-based violence, international human rights law, and the ATT specifically. So if you want to really read in and get into the weeds of this, that paper is excellent. There's also a fact sheet that we developed with the International Gender Champions Group and UNIDIR that looks at some of the issues relating to the ATT and gender. But I think that's my time as well. The last thing I will say is that civil society's commitment to get this into the treaty was the reason it's there. There were other competing issues that people wanted to get into the treaty, and not everything made the final cut. But now that we have it in an international instrument relating to weapons, where gender-based violence can be so horrific and so controlling, that actually this is a really important area for us to continue to work on, so that it is effectively implemented and governments aren't able to say, we don't understand what we're talking about when we say gender-based violence. We need to demonstrate what that is. We need to, without creating further harm for the victims of that gender-based violence, collect that data and make sure it's available for governments so that we can stop some of these weapons transfers where they really will cause immeasurable harm. Thanks, Cecilia. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Verity. Okay. Thank you very much, Verity, again. I'm very sad when you say this is my 10 minutes, because I was like, oh, really? I could go on and listen to your presentations. So I will pass it on to Danielle after, who will also be speaking on the links to the economic side of things. So Danielle, the floor is yours.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Verity. Thank you, Elizabeth. I didn't know Verity through the ATT. Our colleagues, Alison, Ray at Reaching Critical Will and others worked on that. So Verity will have worked on them. I was on TPNW with Elizabeth and others. And the overlap and intersection of issues it's always similar and it's always prevalent and somehow somewhat relentless. I'm going to sort of start from the end and go backwards, I think, in terms of the slow burn and the long game and being late to it. We discussed in the introduction last week the prescience of the first. I like looking at the initial Congress reports from the first WILPF meeting. So the first one at The Hague, when we formed in 1915. I really like the 1919 one. So of course we couldn't meet in 1918 because of what was going on politically with the war, and the 1918 first sort of triennial Congress. And there's some very sophisticated stuff in there on trade, on resources, on approaches to treaties. And I enjoy going back and looking at them and seeing how far we've come and what's still relevant. And most of it is, some of the specifics around the language are different, but the implications are still there. And I think it brings us to 1325 to start on some of the things that Verity was talking back, and to cycle back to the things that Elizabeth discussed, and then to move forward. Many of you on this call, some of you are existing members, some of you we know, some of you we've been told are law, IL and IR students doing masters and such. And so you'll be probably quite familiar with the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Not only was it unanimously adopted in October 2000, it was the first thing to formally recognise the disproportionate and unique harm against women and girls resulting from and after conflict, but also statistic and evidence-based proof of the fact that their involvement in the peace process at all and in every level and in every way, in a meaningful and non-tokenistic way, ensures a deeper and a greater longevity to the peace process. One of the problems with the existence of a lovely resolution like that is sometimes it gets waved as a very convenient flag. Well, 1325 exists and we can all relax now. Obviously, that's not how we in our field feel, because there's a constant need for vigilance. When something is granted, particularly when it's codified in law, which requires accountability and enforcement, otherwise it's just pretty words on a page, there's a constant need to be vigilant as to what rights are either being eroded elsewhere or how they're being evaded and obfuscated elsewhere. So under the guise of 1325, and it's interesting because gender mainstreaming, and we'll come to the economic a little bit in a minute, gender mainstreaming is also something that's very specifically talked about within 1325. So often 1325 is grouped now, it's become loosely associated with women and peace talks. Well, if we just include the word women in peace talks, if we just think of it as a post-conflict reconstructive thing, and we include the word gender, or we include the word women, sometimes that doesn't even mean there are women physically in the room at the table, but if the word is there, then the box is ticked. But actually the transformative agenda of it, and you can go and look at the language, it went further than that. It was about being preventative. It was about adopting a gender perspective on the needs of women and girls at every level. It was looking at the impact of armed conflict. It was looking at including them particularly economically, but in all areas of policy. And that wasn't just specifically relating to post-conflict reconstruction, but about meaningful participation. And a lot of you will know about CEDAW, which is another convention that protects the rights of women, which WILPF, and Mackie is on this call and she's given an introduction to this last week, talks about the protections and the rights of women. And we give our shadow reporting there. And of course, if you take a siloed view of the definitions of women's participation, then you're not really looking at the greatest view of what the harms are, and also of what their equal participation and their ability to flourish and to contribute are, and therefore conflict prevention in the widest view and the widest terminology, because conflict isn't always derived from or ending up in arm-to-arm conflict. It can have all sorts of manifestations, whether it's trade, whether it's economic sanctions, and if minorities aren't included in the statistical analysis and the policies at the domestic level, let alone the international and the trade level, then you get the kind of disparity and the kind of conflict that can arise from that. And that's detail that can be gone into. There are several examples that can be given of subsidies, of trades that were enforced and famines have resulted, or tariffs that were enforced, which have harmed local prices and cause local unrest and therefore local conflict and all of the things that arise there. And internal conflict can cause as much trouble sometimes in a local region as cross-border conflict. And then when you include the fact that a lot of migration is internal, not just transboundaried, and due to things like water issues, the most vulnerable countries are often those where the trade are what we sort of call in economic and development slow to grow, or primary industries. So when you fix and stagnate and try and sort of suffocate or control the global market in that way without a tentative and a sensitive understanding, which is not just received from, but derived from the people on the ground who can tell you this is how we work and this is what we need, then it's a whole new version and a whole new definition of what violence is and how violence is experienced on the ground. Before you even get to conflict, before you even need to start talking about weapons. So one of the things that we look at with groups like the Gender Budgeting Group or Women's Budgeting, I represent WILPF on the European Women's Lobby Feminist Economics Working Group. I contributed to and co-edited the Purple Pack paper, which was a briefing paper on what EPEC, one of our academics, called purple economics, for obvious reasons. And it brings a feminist intersectional lens to, it's not about elevating women, it's about bringing a disaggregated statistic lens. And what that means is, instead of looking at sort of smoothed out statistics, which will give us sort of a bland average of how maybe, for example, a country responded to something or an area responded to something, it gives you all the fine grain of how different demographics have responded. So you can see positively or negatively how different policies can affect. And that means that you can adjust things accordingly, potentially, depending on what you're looking at. It's not a perfect definition, but that's, you know, we have much better statisticians than me, and hopefully better people with language than me, who work on this properly, trying to advise government. Now, internationally, technically speaking, there are international conventions and treaties and a UNSCR, the Security Council resolution, which mandate this sort of thing, but there's a lack of political will. Data has been mentioned, and data is sort of, not all data was made equally. Data, when it comes to this sort of thing, is as good as those who collect it. It's good as those who choose to see it. There can be invisibility, willing invisibility in data. There can be incompetent invisibility in data. And that's one problem. And of course, some of those things are again down to political will, political biases. So, and it's not my place to discuss this here because it's not on our agenda. There's going to be a climate talk. But whether or not it's, I'll come to the Business Human Rights Treaty in a second. There are, I mean, I can read some of them off under the new sort of UN climate change unfolding governance laws that they are building and creating. And I've been there, I've been around those tables, I've been at those discussions. There is a Green Climate Fund technical annex. They are using evidence-based assessments of land forest development policies under the guidance of the Warsaw Framework. I'm concerned about the transparency of who is informing them. They talk about NGOs, they talk about different parties. Of course, if, again, these things are top down and not informed by the people on the ground who are going to be affected the most, I'm concerned about both the quality of the data, the quality and the understanding and the sensitivity of the assessment of that data, and how sensitive the legal coding that will be responsive to that will be. Climate investment funds, all of those, I mean, we've already seen that green bonds and blue bonds, which have been quite fashionable when you scratch below the surface, and I'm not an expert on this, but as far as I understand, aren't particularly green, aren't particularly blue. So the concern when you get into the not just the economic and the financial, but just their assessment of qualitative and quantitative data it's not just bias because, you know, women are dismissed and we live in an unfair and patriarchal world. That's true in some areas. Some of it's simply the fact that if you have people who aren't used to thinking of these things, and you have people on the ground who are seeing what's needed in every area, then they miss things. It's a human fact. It's a natural fallibility. And so it's one of the concerns that we have. And within UK domestic law, this is also a mandated consideration, which is ignored. And there's a lack of political will or a lack of awareness in Westminster. It's much more sophisticated in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, as far as my understanding from the statisticians, gender budgeting friends who do this work in detail. The ignorance to the addition to GDP, to the economy of this country, of unpaid labour in general, but particularly the disproportionate work that women as a legacy have been doing, which hopefully is changing, but it's not credited, and it's fundamentally misunderstood. And what's sad about that is there is a capacity there is a workforce there that can not only, as I said, thrive and flourish, but actually participate and put into an economy which strengthens a nation and makes it a stronger global player. It also makes it makes it a stronger social area, less inclined toward the kind of unrest which makes you vulnerable. That's true here as it is anywhere. So I don't want to, I could, but I don't want to go in too much into the climate area, because it does tie in very much some of the arms work, the vulnerabilities, what happens in some of the trade negotiations that we observe, we audit, we complain about as much as we can. Some of these conflicts are highly predictable. We've already got red flags. I've written reports to show red flags over several areas, because they have the sort of perfect storm of primary industry, water disputes, historical conflict, underpaid or unpaid women, migration issues, and the tentative issues of possible climate, genuine ongoing climate issues, which are part of their natural ecosystem, amongst other things. And then when you add the arms trade going through there, it's the perfect storm. So we sort of look out for those things. And we have those of us who look at it from an economics point of view, and then you look at trade deals that happen, and you can see a match being lit. You can see a match being lit and dropped over somewhere particularly vulnerable, when a coerced or conditional, a coerced trade is being done, or what was criticised a lot in the early 2000s, which was conditional lending by the IMF. Which was supposed to have stopped, but is sneaking its way back in. It's a kind of, if you remember the buzzword of predatory lending, if you think of what you imagine that means, and then look at that on the global stage, it's a blurry view of what that is, because there isn't time on this call, because I'd have to spend an hour myself to actually go through examples of what some structural adjustment and conditionality and poverty reconstruction papers actually did to certain countries. But some of them caused a lot of harm for, in my opinion, quite spurious reasons. Some of them, I think, well-intentioned, but just inept and incompetent, which we see a lot. To touch on the Business Human Rights Treaty, which, let me try and remember it. The legally binding instrument to regulate in international human rights law the activities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises. There you go. At the moment, it's at zero draft. It's a draft treaty. It's sort of open for discussion. There are hedge fund managers, financial institutions, banks, large corporations, SMEs, states, NGOs, all manner of groups involved. And it's really the first time, if there are students on this call, what are probably being taught is about the bifurcation, which is their lovely buzzword, between international human rights law and economic law. And it's the first time that these two things are being held together. It's not corporate human rights obligations under international law, but the body of the text brings something that can be possibly corporate liability under domestic law, which really moves things into a new direction in a way that standardization to human rights law has never really been seen before. And I think it's probably a good time to talk about the AI stuff and killer robots, and probably to hand back to Verity to tell us where we are on that campaign. But I think that covers just the economic side. I think Elizabeth talked about TPNW and divestment. There's no point in my repeating it. But those are the way we sort of circumference all of those things and how they bleed in together from the WPS and economics framework.
Okay. Thank you very much, Danielle. Yes, I will swiftly move on to Verity, and then possibly have some questions, but I'm aware of time. So Verity, over to you.
Okay, so we will get to the questions. All I'm going to say about the campaign to stop killer robots is I've just put the web link in the chat for everyone. There's some amazing videos and resources on there for you to look at. And in the UK this autumn, we are going to need people to mobilise. So if you know academics, researchers, university support staff, vice chancellors, you might have some of those in your phone book, university board of governors, student union leaders, or if you are a student, we want to help stop people creating AI technology that could be used in lethal autonomous weapons. We want them to make that choice themselves until there is regulation preventing that type of technology from being used to target and kill people. We want to retain meaningful human control over this emerging technology. There's a whole other process underway at the UN to try and make that happen. The UK government currently does not see the need for another international instrument on this. It is being difficult, it is blocking progress. A small group of governments are emerging that want to hopefully lead this process, but are trying not to put their heads too far above the water at the moment. So as the UK campaign, with my other hat on, where I work with Tanya and Elizabeth, we are looking to change that position here in the UK. It's really important. There is so much information. It's really interesting as well as a topic. So I do encourage you to read around it, but I'm going to stop there so that we can have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Verity. I will open the floor to questions. So if anyone does have one, please either raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Let it be known. Yes, Sheila. I will unmute you. Wait a second. Oh, you're Sheila. Oh my goodness.
We often hear that when conflicts are resolved, when treaties are made after conflicts, that those that include women's participation are longer lasting and more effective. I wonder if any of you could elaborate on that and give us some chapter and verse and information on when we make that statement.
Thank you. Anyone that wants to pick up on that question? Elizabeth.
Well, I can't remember the authors or the names of the studies right now, but I know that people have done a few different analysis into this, and I think that, yeah, the links are on the UN Women website. I'll find them and send them to Cecilia so you can pass them on. But for those who don't know, yes, this was looked into with a few different peace agreements, and it was sort of shown by the researchers that, yeah, when you do include women, basically when you do have inclusive peace processes, that they're longer lasting and more sort of beneficial to countries emerging from conflicts. And I think for all of us here, that would be for obvious reasons, but it's good to be able to have the the data to back that up. So I think that's very important, and it's very important to be able to say it's not just something we assert, but it's something that there's clear evidence for this.
Yeah. I think the stats say that a peace agreement that has women involved this lasts 5 years, approximately 5 years longer than one where women are not involved, if that is still the case. So yes, yes, as I said, there will be links to everything. So if you do have, I also seen that some people have put links on the chat privately mostly. So I will also add those. We have a question from Janet, which asks, which are the countries that support the Stop Killer Robots campaign? And then the other question, Scott, is from Valerie, but it's about the EU. So I'll ask that first. So which countries are supporting the Stop Killer Robots campaign?
I'm going to check with Elizabeth whether we're saying this publicly yet, or
okay.
if we're still working discreetly.
I think we can probably just not go into those specifics and just maybe talk about some of the endorsers, Elizabeth?
Yeah,
the public champions?
Yeah, there's 30 countries which have sort of called for a ban in international forums, like in the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, where this is being discussed, or at discussions at the UN General Assembly. And there's a list of those on the website link that Verity sent. A few countries have made specific proposals to move things forward recently. There was a paper from Austria, Chile and Brazil, I think now a couple of years ago, which was basically a one-line paper proposing that there should be a legal instrument on this issue. So there is support there. There's not yet, as Verity was saying, kind of a strong push for things forward. At the moment this year, we're looking to see states kind of elaborate what their detailed views are about what should be in a treaty, what should meaningful human control over weapons systems and the use of force mean, and what are the components of that. So we have a strong basis for work. But in the international forum where it's being discussed right now, it's unlikely there'll be a legal instrument coming out of that for political and technical reasons, due to the fact that it operates by consensus as a forum and several countries want to kind of veto progress there. But yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you. I'll keep reading from the chat. Valerie asks, what will the impact of Brexit, or of the EU, the UK exiting the European Union will have on the campaigns that you've mentioned and projects towards stopping mass destruction, essentially, as she puts it. So yeah, any impact of Brexit?
Yeah, great question, and I think there's several different, there's technical problems so that they're going to be caused. At the moment, the UK Export Control Act is taken from the EU Common Position, and we've been saying, is everything staying the same? Are you making any changes? The UK government is supposed to be reviewing its arms export policy at the moment, because the High Court recently found the Secretary of State to be acting irrationally and irresponsibly when it came to transfers to Saudi. The Campaign Against the Arms Trade and other organisations took the government to court for that recently, and the risk assessment process that the government is using has been found to be lacking in its rigour. So we are concerned that it will be used as a reason to weaken export licensing control. I think on the international stage as well, and it'll be interesting to see how it's appeared to Elizabeth and Tanya in the processes you work in, but government and official brainpower has all been sucked away for the last few years. And actually, there's no leadership, there's no real work or effort that I can see in the ATT arena from the UK, because anybody who was any good in government has been taken to the Brexit team and has just been working on that. So government capacity and interest is lower than I've ever seen it before. I mean, we had the UK ambassador for arms make a statement because he hadn't checked with other colleagues back in the UK. And he said something like, the UK does not recognise the gendered impact of armed conflict and armed violence. And it took us a little while, not long, but a little while to get him to retract that statement. And his colleagues in DFID and other places were devastated that that's what the UK was saying in the international arena. But it came at the same time as the US was trying to change language across a host of international instruments and stop talking about women's reproductive rights and talk about reproductive function. And when you see the UK and the US's relationship, I might be cynical, but I see an influence there, and I see the US asking for support. And unfortunately, I think the UK has been doing some very damaging things in that respect. And I know it's being filmed, but everything I've said has happened. So I'm quite happy for that to stay on the record.
Because it is on the record.
No, absolutely. I have another question privately, actually regarding the US. So we've been seeing some pretty heavy control of protests in the US. Can any of these regulations, laws be applied to the weapons? Oh, okay, sorry, mentioned by Cecilia, but obviously you wouldn't know. I mentioned last week the crowd control weapons, the export of crowd control weapons by the UK to the US. So those are the weapons that I was mentioning. Not really only weapons, but yes. Can any of these regulations regulate that type of export?
So the scope of the ATT is quite specific, but some things that you would associate with that type of crowd control are in there. So yes, and the risk assessment asks you to look at the end user's form, as it were. You know, is there a risk that these end users, be it police or military or security, could use these weapons to commit human rights violations? So as we see more of that misuse coming, then yes, this type of instrument could be useful. There is also a push at the moment by Amnesty and an organisation called Amiga and several others to increase the regulation around what we would call tools of torture. So weaponry or materials that, although they have a legitimate use, if misused, could actually be used to torture another human being or eventually kill them. There are some things that we think should be 100% banned and shouldn't be in use, like electric shock batons, but there are others that we feel need stronger regulation because we're seeing an increased use of misuse rather. And Amnesty just launched a really interesting, I mean, quite distressing to look at, but useful to see how tear gas is being used on peaceful protesters and the increased use of it in using too many canisters for the space that you're firing it into, firing it directly at people, using it where the people have no means of vacating the area because the police will pin them into an area first and then fire the tear gas. So Amnesty's collecting that evidence on a digital platform so that that can be used for more advocacy efforts as well as we move forward.
Thank you very much. I just think, oh, sorry.
Just to very briefly add to that, it comes under the AI stuff as well. I mean, what Verity's talking about, sometimes you already have laws in place that are good, and the problem is when someone decides to redefine and reinterpret those laws for their own benefit. So you've got essentially the use of a chemical weapon being redefined on its own people. And when we talk about some of the automated stuff that could be used for border control, then it's essentially reappropriated for domestic uses. That could come under those things. We're talking about lethally autonomous weapon systems. Now, to be very clear, and I know that we're finished, try to get a cartoon image of a Terminator or a robot out of your mind. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about a system of functions that together target and process the information, choose who to kill, and then carry out that act in whatever it is, whether it's a missile, whether it's a shot, whether it's those things can then by any state be engaged however they want on their own people. So when you talk about border, whether it's crowd control, whether it's, I mean, you look at some of the regimes that are in place, they can use whatever they want and define it however they want. So for unfolding technology, there are legitimate concerns for exactly those reasons.
Just to add very quickly to what Tanya was saying, a problem that we deal with in international regulation is often a clear line is drawn between armed conflict and policing in weapons uses and treaties, right? So if we ban killer robots for use in war, it possibly still leaves a space in policing. And you see this, for example, in the Chemical Weapons Convention, where tear gas is banned for use in war, but it is legal still for use in policing. So these are some of the problems we face.
Yeah, and finding again, where do you draw the line is becoming increasingly hard to understand. Well, thank you very much, all of you. As I said earlier, I could listen, and I'm sure that everyone agrees that we could listen to you forever and ever. So please, let's keep this conversation going in this and other forums. Thank you to Tanielle, Elizabeth, and Verity. As I mentioned earlier, everything that they've said and the resources that they've shared with us will be online. So the conversation and the education of each and every one of us can continue. I invite you to the next seminar, which will be this time not on Thursday, but on Tuesday, the 30th. And will be led by Maki, and we will have another 2 speakers just like today. I keep the suspense now, but I will send invitations probably tomorrow. But look out for an invitation from WILPF, and I will see you all next week. Thank you again, and good evening. Enjoy the sun while it lasts. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.